He had been 3 slides into a quarterly presentation when the phone buzzed against the glass table. The boardroom windows framed the city in a neat, manicured horizon. The world looked like a balance sheet, tidy, controlled, predictable. Roberto Tavares had taught himself to live by that view. Numbers gave him certainty. Strategy gave him comfort. The name on the screen cut through both. Sofia, it read. He thumbed the call open before the second ring finished. A child's voice came through, thin and urgent, almost strangled by fear. "Daddy, she won't give me food. It's been 3 days." The words had the blunt, honest logic of a child. The room blurred around him. A long silence fell, as if someone had reached for the power switch and cut the lights. Roberto stood so quickly his chair screeched against marble. A dozen questions tried to arrive at once. Who was she? Why 3 days? Why had no one told him? He felt the meeting drain away like a coat being shrugged off. People around him said his name. He registered it without processing it. He asked only, "Where are you?" through the phone, and the tremor in the tiny reply was the last safe thing he heard before he left everything else behind. The drive home was a series of red lights and impatient city sounds. He remembered every second of the hour as if he were trying to stitch time back together. The phone call, the accelerating pulse in his throat, the wrongness of the locked gate when he arrived. The grand house that had always felt like a museum had the small, terrible hush of something not quite right. Patricia Almeida met him at the door. She wore the composed smile of someone accustomed to being judged by appearances. In the family's glossy photographs, she had been the warm, competent presence, a private tutor hired to guide Sofia through early school years, to provide structure while Roberto was away. She had keys, an access code, and a tidy contract that legitimized her constant presence. She had lived in one wing of the house under the pretense of round-the-clock care. That arrangement had felt like an answer to every working father's prayer. Tonight, it felt like an arrangement gone dangerously wrong. "He's at the meeting," Patricia said, voice level. She was not the type to panic. Her hands were steady. That steadiness felt like a wall between them, an invitation for Roberto to trust the surface of things. "Sofia was being difficult," she explained. "We were trying a disciplinary measure." Roberto pushed past her into the corridor. The nursery door was closed, the kind of door that made noise when you shoved it. It would not open. Patricia had locked it from the outside. He looked for a key. None. He found the bowl first, white ceramic, near the sink in the small kitchen where staff shared meals. Clean, bone dry. In the sink beside it, the faint smear of a spoon. No crumbs, no cup that belonged to a child who had not eaten for days. There was a small box of matches, a jar of preserved food on a high shelf, a child's pencil rolled under the stove. He banged his palm against the door until it shook. "Open it!" he demanded. The voice on the other side did not respond. He felt heat rise through his chest, and then, clearer, shame. The house that had always been an extension of his success had become a place that could hide a child within reach, yet cut her off from something as basic as a meal. When the lock finally gave, a locksmith would later describe it as a simple mechanism, not sophisticated, but sufficient when paired with the distance in a father's life. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and a child's bed linen. Sofia sat on the small bed, knees pulled to her chest like a question mark. She looked smaller than she should have, as if the light had missed parts of her. Her eyes were wide, and her voice, when she said, "Daddy," was the sound of a thing that had been waiting for rescue. They went straight to the hospital. The emergency room smelled of disinfectant and fluorescent light. Dr. Paulo Mendez took one look at Sofia and ordered the immediate basics: blood work, fluids, a weight check. The scale confirmed the worst. At 7 years old, Sofia weighed 22 kilograms. The number landed in the room like an accusation. Roberto had memorized the expected numbers for playbooks and budgets. He had not known this one by heart. The physician used words that were clinical but blunt: chronic malnutrition, signs of dehydration, emotional withdrawal.
Nothing about the phrasing softened the implication. The nurse charted loss of appetite and failure to thrive in the boxy medical shorthand that made personal disasters into neat rectangles. Sofia was thin in the way that small bones can be. She had bruises that the staff recorded as healing without elaboration. They did not sketch details to spare the child's dignity. What showed more than any mark was absence, the emptiness around the edges of a life made to look full. There were no toys with worn spots, no clothes showing evidence of frantic washing. Whatever filled the house had been curated for photographs and appearances. Roberto sat through the intake while someone from social services took down names. The hospital admitted Sofia for stabilization and observation. She would receive fluids, calories, and the careful attention that the human body demands in order to begin to remember how to rest. The shock in the first hours did something sharp to him and something slower to the rest of his life. He had been a father in panels and emails, a man who signed permission slips and left the rest to others. Suddenly, all the outsourcing of a child's care, nannies, tutors, schedules, delegated love, became a ledger of neglect. He felt the grown public parts of himself peeled away and the raw vulnerability beneath exposed. By the time the medical team had stabilized Sofia, Roberto had already begun to assemble a different team. Fernando Almeida, the family lawyer, arrived with a briefcase and an expression that combined professional calm with private concern. Fernando had handled property disputes, contracts, reputational damage. He had not handled a case that involved a living, breathing child in immediate danger. Still, his mind worked on containment, evidence preservation, immediate protective steps, and the delicate choreography of media and the law. Cristina Mura, the social worker from the Municipal Child Protection Agency, took over the welfare interview. Her badge said Child Protection, and her voice was both gentle and unyielding. She explained the basics, the temporary removal of the child from the guardian's immediate custody, the need to document what they had found, the legal process that would follow. A protective order, she said, could be sought that day. The word temporary hung between them like a possible lifeline. Roberto could feel its edges and did not yet know whether it would be long enough. Dr. Helena Rios, a child psychologist with a reputation for careful, empathic work, sat by Sofia's bedside and spoke to her in a cadence calibrated for safety. She brought drawing supplies and paper with heavy lines, explaining the exercise as play. Sofia drew without fuss at first, a house, a small figure, a bigger figure, and bars between them. At the top, in block letters the child had learned at school, she wrote a single word, hunger. The page felt like a small, pure kind of proof. It was not dramatic. It was not an accusation in legal form. It was a child's attempt to make meaning of a need, and that act of making was itself a kind of testimony. Back at the house, Fernando worked through the legal implications with a clear set of priorities. First, secure the child. Second, preserve evidence. Third, ensure that witnesses were protected from retaliation. He recommended obtaining copies of all logs and recordings, and he called Lucas Martins, a forensic technologist who specialized in digital evidence and security systems. Lucas arrived with a laptop and a seriousness that suited the gravity of the task. He explained his role in straightforward terms. Data doesn't lie. It can be altered, but if we act quickly, we can recover files, timestamps, and access histories that will show what happened. He stressed speed. Hard drives could be wiped, cloud backups overwritten, cameras disabled. They began a methodical sweep. CCTV footage existed in pieces, the entrance hole cameras, the driveway cam, and certain internal ones placed in common areas. A nanny camera over the kitchen, a small dome in the ceiling that the household had installed to monitor children when the family traveled, had footage.
The timestamp on a grainy clip showed a hand Patricia's hand, Lucas would later identify by its bracelet and gait, moving to a latch on the kitchen door and fastening a padlock. The clip was little more than a series of frames, but put end to end it made an atmosphere, a conscious act of preventing access. Lucas explained what the clip meant without theatrics. The footage shows the tutor securing the kitchen door at 17:42 on 3 separate evenings over the past month while the household was recorded as unoccupied. That coincides with times that Sofia's school records show missed lunches. When I cross-referenced the door's keypad logs, the door shows authorized lock entries that match her access code. He spoke plainly. The logs were a digital ledger of comings and goings. Those logs were nearly impossible to fake without leaving traces. They were particularly useful because they didn't require testimony from memory. They existed independently of anyone's account. They collected bank statements, too. On paper, Patricia's accounts were ordinary, a modest salary, some savings, a few transfers in. But in the months before Sofia's hospitalization, there were transactions that drew a pattern. Designer boutiques, expensive dinners in exclusive areas, an odd vagueness around child-related purchases. There were no receipts for school supplies, for children's clothes, for vitamins, or other items that would have been expected for a child under specialized in-home care. The numbers did not make a case on their own, but they suggested priorities. At Sofia's school, Marcia Fontes, the director, had files in a neat folder. Teachers' notes became part of the mosaic. A pattern of Sofia falling asleep in class, lacking energy for recess, having no packed lunches some days, and a teacher's quiet but growing concern when Sofia presented a drawing with bars and the word hunger. The drawing had been tucked into the school's file that morning, the teacher said, and if anyone could explain it, they hoped Roberto would. The director's eyes stung in that meeting. She had wanted to act, but the child had been in the care of a trusted adult. The staff had been fearful of making accusations that could destroy someone's employment and a family's reputation. That fear was now exposed as a dangerous inertia. Joanna, the housekeeper, arrived so quietly that at first Roberto did not recognize her. Her hands were those of a person who had polished the same surfaces for years. The lines on them were a geography of endurance. She had worked for the family long before Patricia's arrival and had seen the tutor settle in with a deference that became authority. Joanna spoke in low phrases, eyes flicking from face to face as if measuring the risk of each word. "I was scared," she whispered, and it was the most human sentence in all the legal language. "She was very kind when the master and mistress came. She was sharp with me. She said I wasn't professional enough. The first time I asked if Sofia had eaten, she told me to mind my work. I kept quiet. I didn't want to lose this job." Joanna had a recording on her phone. She had pressed the small red button, hands trembling, as Patricia had chastised her in the pantry the week before. The clip was not cinematic. It was domestic and precise. Patricia's voice instructing Joanna on how to ration certain food, telling the housekeeper to tell family members that Sofia preferred smaller portions. The audio was a small, brittle truth. It would be a contested piece of evidence, of course, but in the moment, it sounded like an admission. The first night in the hospital, when the IV line hissed and monitors measured small improvements, Roberto sat in an anonymous chair and realized he had never known how to be small with his child. He had been a formidable negotiator, a man who could command a room. With his daughter's hand in his, he felt the opposite, a new sort of helplessness that demanded a different skill set: presence. He called the staff list, assembling a team who would operate in different domains. Fernando would handle the legal containment and immediately seek protective orders. Cristina would shepherd the welfare interview and contact the appropriate child protection services. Dr. Helena would begin trauma-informed interviews with Sofia when appropriate, using play and drawing, not interrogation. Lucas would secure digital traces. Each person was a specialized hand on an emergency procedure none of them had expected to run in the Tavares house. As investigators went to work, the private tutor's public face held. Patricia gave statements with the confident tone of someone trained to manage reputation. She refused to use the phrase disciplinary measure at first, preferring milder words. When pressed, her voice sharpened into an argument about structure, routines, and the necessity of enforcing limits. To anyone who had not seen the footage, she seemed like a caregiver who had attempted a difficult method and had been accused unfairly. That duality, the same person receiving praise in public and acting in a way that harmed, became a central problem. It was how power hid. Legal moves followed the logic of speed and containment. Fernando filed for an emergency protective order, citing the hospital's findings and the immediate risk to Sofia's welfare. The order sought to limit Patricia's access to the child and to mandate that she leave the family residence pending investigation. The judge, Dr. Carlos Mendez, signed the order after a brief hearing. The word temporary again sat there as both shield and promise. This was the moment when the battle lines shifted from private to public. Patricia's legal counsel, Dr. Sergio Braga, entered the narrative with the efficiency of someone who had long defended clients against reputational calamity. He questioned witnesses' motives. He framed Joanna as unreliable, a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind.
He highlighted gaps in timestamps and suggested alternative explanations for the padlock footage. Maintenance, a forgotten key, a misinterpreted disciplinary choice. He argued in familiar patterns: doubt, motive, context. That is when the other machinery began: reputation management and, simultaneously, a smear engine. Patricia's team circulated a narrative that Verdana headlines would later paraphrase: private tutor unfairly accused, family in turmoil, be wary of unverified claims. An orchestrated PR push began to reframe the story. Social media, hungry for friction, amplified the counterclaim that the father had been absent, that staff had misread a pedagogical method, that the child had complex issues unrelated to temporary measures. The aim was to muddy the water. The smear campaign did not stay in the ether. It landed on faces. Juana's phone began to ring with menacing silence, calls with no voices, private messages accusing her of lying, veiled threats that suggested consequences she did not need spelled out. Teachers received messages from anonymous accounts questioning their professionalism and motives. The pressure was not only public, it became personal. Fernando urged caution. "We preserve evidence and protect witnesses," he said. He recommended a safe room for depositions, limited disclosure of contact information, and a communication strategy that would avoid inflaming the narrative. But there was another, quieter strategy at work: Roberto's own recalibration. He began to cancel non-essential meetings. He delegated committee oversight he had once cherished. He stopped waking to spreadsheet alarms and began sleeping in a chair at the hospital beside Sofia. Presence, he realized, was the only kind of wealth that mattered now. Sofia's recovery in the early week was slow and non-linear. She ate a small bowl of soup that evening and later of mashed potato, each spoonful taken under the watch of nurses like a carefully choreographed rescue. She had trouble trusting that food would not be withheld again. Dr. Helena's presence was a small, constant thing, a voice that did not hurry, an exercise that turned a child's drawing into a bridge for conversation. When Sofia drew again in the dim of the hospital playroom, her lines were shakier, but the word hunger had been replaced by a little sun and a drawing that held a hand reaching for another hand. It was not closure. It was a beginning. The first full week of the investigation was an evidence-driven montage that felt at times like a detective procedural and at other times like a messy family portrait come apart at the seams. Lucas extracted emails, phone logs, and access records. He explained to Roberto how metadata could be more persuasive than any testimony, not because it was emotionless, but because it was hard to dispute. He pulled up a timeline.
Kitchen padlock engaged at 1742 on several evenings. Keycard logs showing Patricia's access on nights when the family was out. CCTV frames that synchronized with absentee lunches at school. Each item by itself was suggestive. Together, the pattern began to form a case. The school file offered support. Teachers' notes and attendance logs were entered under official letterhead. A teacher's statement described how Sofia had once hid behind a coat in the classroom and said she was not hungry but sad. Another recorded parental failure to respond in timely ways. Those small annotations, made with institutional care, provided a narrative continuity that would be crucial in court. Roberto's public life reacted as one might expect. Investors asked questions about focus. A rival shareholder asked for reassurances. There were inevitable whispers at donor dinners and invitations that suddenly had to be declined. Yet each of those logistical frustrations felt pale against the scale of what he now understood as the central task: to protect and heal. At night, when the house was dark again and Sofia slept in a hospital cot that did not belong to any branded lifestyle magazine, Roberto replayed moments in his head like an inventory of omission. He thought of the times he had delegated a child's care to a person who came with credentials and a smile. He thought of the contract clause that allowed Patricia to live on site. He thought of promotions chased and school plays missed. Guilt was a raw currency he could not spend away. It fueled a kind of clarity instead. Evidence had a way of rearranging the moral geometry of the story. The combination of medical records, the drawing with its blunt word, the CCTV padlock clip, the keypad logs, Joanna's recorded confession, and the bank statements had a cumulative, clarifying effect. It made the narrative harder to deny. Fernando knew the limits. The defense would attack each piece, question each witness, attempt to paint motive and uncertainty. Still, in those early days, the evidence created a foundation from which to move forward. When the public protective order was granted, the house felt emptier. Patricia packed a small bag and left under the terms of the order, maintaining in public statements that she was being targeted for her competence. Her legal team hinted at counterclaims. The story had a legal skeleton now: allegations and restrictions, evidence and contestation. But the legal action did not stop the world from talking. The smear took shape in op-eds and in the comment sections of viral posts. Some defended Patricia on the grounds of overreaction. Some, facing the knot of the story and their own fear, sided with the father. Others took joy in the spectacle of a wealthy man humbled. The narrative spilled into new arenas: cafes, schoolyards, the private circles where people had once admired the Tavares household without seeing its scaffolding.
Meanwhile, Joanna told Roberto something that lodged in him like a shard. She was very careful, she said. Not everything was physical. Sometimes it was what she didn't do. Sometimes it was a look. Joanna's confession was not cinematic. It was day-to-day cruelty disguised as discipline. It was the slow erosion of a child's needs by someone who controlled access in the house, to food, to warmth, to company. That form of harm was harder to brand in headlines, but it showed up in numbers and in the child's small, truthful drawings. Lucas found another small but telling piece: deleted text messages that, when recovered, suggested that Patricia had coordinated narratives with a small circle of confidants. He explained the process without jargon. When someone deletes a message, traces often remain. If you act quickly, you can sometimes recover enough to show intent. Recovering those texts gave the team a thread to follow, a sequence of messages that framed the child's behavior as defiant and instructed staff to keep it under control. The words were not violent in themselves, but they were part of a pattern where instruction replaced care. At the same time, Roberto faced intimate reckonings. He saw photographs of himself at corporate galas, shaking hands and smiling in the company of people who had no context for the small, urgent work of being a father.
He began to decline interviews, to speak only when necessary, and to prioritize the visits to the hospital. He learned how to measure a spoon with patient fingers and to read the silent cues that a child in recovery uses to judge whether the world is safe again. The days multiplied into a rhythm of hospital visits, legal strategy sessions, and interviews with social services. Each action had a ripple effect. Christina worked to arrange temporary foster-like accommodations when the hospital could no longer keep Sofia, coordinating with licensed caregivers who specialized in trauma-informed care. Dr. Helena scheduled play therapy sessions, carefully calibrated to let Sofia lead the pace. Fernando prepared subpoenas and preserved chain of custody for items taken from the house. Lucas cataloged the recovered files and time-stamped everything. In the midst of this, a small scene stayed with Roberto. One afternoon, in a quiet corridor of the hospital, he watched his daughter accept, for the first time in days, a slice of orange. She held it with the small, secretive reverence of someone reconnecting with something once denied. Her cheeks, for the first time, had a suggestion of roundness. She hummed as she ate, a sound of concentration and small self-possession. It was not a turning of the tide, but it felt like an opening. When protective custody was made official for the immediate term, and Patricia was ordered not to contact the child or the household staff, Roberto thought the worst of the battle had been won.
He had not anticipated how quickly the conflict would migrate from closed rooms to public feeds. Patricia's legal team began to push back with calls to her competence and with sympathetic narratives about a professional whose reputation was being unfairly damaged. The press repeated the narratives, and the noise grew. He realized that even if the law moved in predictable ways, the public court of opinion could punish in different ways, by silencing witnesses, by creating fear where there should be avowal. Joanna reported that anonymous messages had become more insistent. A van had been seen parked near the staff quarters. Teachers at the school admitted to receiving unnerving emails. The team's strategy shifted from simply gathering proof to protecting people who spoke. Fernando arranged for depositions to be taken in secure rooms. Christina put the housekeeper into a witness protection-like arrangement, not government-run, but a private measure to ensure her safety while the investigation continued. And then came the small, definitive moment that would later be replayed in summaries, a quiet clip from an internal camera that had not been part of the original sweep. Someone had overlooked a small nanny cam aimed toward the pantry. The camera had been enabled for weeks to monitor for pests and staff safety. On one frame, Patricia closed the pantry door, cruised the perimeter as if checking the scene, and then, briefly, almost imperceptibly, ran her fingers over the padlock as if assuring herself of the barrier. The image was not sensational. It was a single human act caught by a machine that refused to forget. It connected in a way that numbers and statements did not. It showed intention. The case had become an architecture of tiny truths assembled into something larger. Medical readings, a child's drawing, a padlock on a kitchen, a housekeeper's trembling recording, recovered texts, bank transactions. Each piece alone was not decisive. Together, they began to form a portrait that resisted easy denial. Yet the story was not over. The smear campaign accelerated. An op-ed questioned whether fathers who had delegated care could now be blamed for the lapses of hired staff. Another column suggested caution before ruining reputations. Online commentators debated the meaning of discipline. The cumulative effect was to intimidate and to recast the narrative. At the center of it all, Roberto learned how to be present in a way he had not before. He sat through therapy sessions, held his daughter's hand while she slept, and learned to put small, ordinary acts of care ahead of his calendar.
he found that presence did not erase guilt, but it molded it into something useful: resolve. The conflict moved into a phase where the test was no longer only about whether the law could move efficiently. It was now about whether truth could survive a smear.
The team prepared for the momentum that would come with a trial. Witness coaching that preserved authenticity, forensic reports compiled in accessible language, and a communications plan that would shield vulnerable witnesses from harassment. They did not know the outcome. No one could promise a verdict. All they could do was to prepare. On the day the protective order was served, as Patricia left the property accompanied by her attorney, a small group of television vans had already started to gather at the curb. A microphone pushed into the frame, and a prepared line, dispassionate and rehearsed, was released about allegations and ongoing proceedings. Roberto watched his private life becoming a public narrative. He felt exposed in a new way, not by display, but by the necessity of fighting for a child's most basic needs in full view of strangers. That night, as the streetlights painted long yellow bars across his driveway, Joanna whispered that someone had left a note under the broom closet door. It was a threat, edged in formality but vicious in intent. The house became quieter, but not safer. Patricia's absence lingered like a hole. The team had won a temporary legal step. They had not yet won the core battle, to ensure that the child's future would not be shaped by fear. Roberto stood at the window of the hospital room and watched the city that had always been his domain continue its ordinary life. Somewhere below, a taxicab idled. The world kept breathing. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass and made himself a vow that was both simple and radical, that he would no longer be an absentee steward of his child's life. He would learn to be present in ways his work had never required. He would learn to listen. The next morning, as a new montage of depositions and data extraction began, the team found another small piece that tightened the timeline, a pattern of keypad entries that correlated with the nights Sofia missed lunches, and an email from Patricia to a friend explaining her method in language that implied control more than care. It was another thread, another modest but meaningful confirmation. The evidence would be litigated. The witnesses would be cross-examined. The media would keep talking. But inside a small hospital room, between spoonfuls of soup and the careful drawings of a child, the more important work had begun, tending to a child who would have to learn, slowly and deliberately, how to trust the world again. Outside, the press cycles churned. Inside, a small team of people kept their attention on details, paper, pixels, and the lived testimony of a housekeeper who had gathered courage, a teacher who had noticed, and a daughter who had written one raw word on a page. Those small things had already begun to push back against a polite veneer of competence and reputation. And as the week closed on an uneasy, watchful note, Patricia's media machine shifted gears from denial to insinuation.
Anonymous tips began to leak, with suggested narratives that aimed to erode the credibility of the housekeeper and the school staff. A televised commentator asked, in a neutral voice, whether wealthy families were being hounded by a culture of accusation. The effect was immediate. Witnesses who had been willing to come forward hesitated. Joanna grew more frightened. A teacher called in sick. Fernando tightened the legal circle. He subpoenaed records. He advised minimal public statements. He urged Roberto to keep the focus on Sofia, not on sound bites. Roberto obeyed, but the pressure of public scrutiny pulled at the edges of his composure. Each small salvage operation, a recorded interview in a secure room, a protective measure for a frightened witness, felt like a hand pulling them back from the cliff of public opinion. And yet, in private rooms and under the unblinking light of computer screens, the evidence kept speaking. It would need to survive the theater of a court, layers of challenge and rebuttal. For now, it simply existed, a ripple of facts that might cohere into a verdict or might dissolve under attack. Roberto had no illusions about certainty. He only had a small, steady hope that truth, assembled carefully and defended persistently, could pierce whatever fog of social reputation the other side threw up. Late that night, Joanna came to the makeshift safe house to hand over a small bag of items she had taken from the pantry. Among them, in a paper towel, was a stamped grocery receipt with dates that overlapped with the padlock timestamps, and an unassuming little packet of infant cereal, unopened, as if someone had planned for a child's needs and then decided otherwise. The items were mundane, but they fit into the jagged puzzle that the team was assembling. They were proof that small things, when collected patiently, added up. Roberto sat at a small table that looked out onto a quiet street and stretched his hands over a warm mug. The warmth felt like an ally. He allowed himself a brief image, a table where bowls were filled and hands were steady and a child's laughter was permitted to grow. He had no idea how long it would take to reach that place. He only knew the path began with evidence, with witnesses, and with a stubborn commitment to being present. The story had not reached its turn yet. The protective orders and the early forensic findings had set the stage. The opponent had resources and a narrative machine. Witnesses were frightened. The media was hungry. But the little acts of clarity, Sofia's drawing, the padlock footage, Joanna's recorded voice, had loosened a seam. Now the work would be to press that seam until it opened. The next morning, the mainstream outlet ran a headline that framed the controversy as a clash between a high-profile family and a trusted employee. Patricia's counsel issued a statement questioning motive. Online, commentators debated. In the quiet of that same morning, a nurse brought a new drawing to Roberto. A son, a plate with food, and two small figures holding hands. Sofia had drawn it with a small, decisive stroke. She had written, in a child's uneven letters, "Home." Roberto folded the paper slowly, as if it were the new kind of contract he had to sign, one that could not be filed away or negotiated away. It required him to be available, to listen, to reorder priorities that once seemed immovable. The battle ahead would demand more than legal acumen. It would demand sacrifice and patience and the willingness to be publicly vulnerable. Outside, the snow of headlines continued, some malicious, some sympathetic. Inside, the evidence continued to accumulate in small, steady piles, each piece making the picture clearer. The protective order had bought them time, but not the end of trouble. Patricia had not yet spoken in court. The defense strategy would arrive. Witnesses might crack under pressure. The public narrative might tilt. Roberto held the drawing to the light, and for the first time since the boardroom phone had buzzed, felt something like a plan that was not measured in profit margins. He could not promise a swift resolution. He could not promise justice at the end of a neat triangle. He could promise only to stay, to protect, and to let the slow work of truth find its footing. The house would remain a scene. The footage would be catalogued. Joanna would be kept safe. The school drawings would be measured for pattern. The bank accounts would be traced. The press would continue to push. It was the beginning of a trial, in both senses, a legal contest and a test of what love can do when it's finally awake enough to be present. And so they gathered themselves for the next phase, aware that the hard part was not the gathering of facts, but the endurance to carry them forward, while the world watched and gossiped and speculated. Roberto, for the first time, counted his priorities in a new currency. Presence would be the measure. He would learn, day by day, how to be wealthy in the one way that mattered, by being there when someone needed him most. If there was a moment when the private life of the Tavares house became a public trial, it arrived not in a single thunderclap, but as a steady, grinding escalation. Depositions began within days. Subpoenas arrived at dawn. Patricia's team pushed back with its own subpoenas, a legal mesh designed to slow discovery and to signal to the press that this was a contested narrative. Roberto watched the process like a man learning an unfamiliar instrument, every motion precise, necessary, and somehow wrong to be playing in public. Before the first formal hearing, Fernando gathered the team in a small windowless conference room at his firm.
There were printouts stacked like little altars of evidence, photographs of the padlock, the recovered text threads, the grocery receipt, the hospital charts, the teacher's notes, and the drawings, each page a shard of testimony. Lucas spread out a timeline on his laptop and walked through it step by simple step. "This is the story that the data tells," he said. "Not the story told by faces or by convenience, but the one that emerges when timestamps are lined up. Each keypad entry, each file access, each frame of footage creates a spine. You can shadow that spine, or you can try to break it. Breaking it requires inconsistencies we don't have." He showed them the pattern. The padlock engaged at 1742 on nights when the family was out. Keypad authorizations under Patricia's code at times that matched school attendance gaps. CCTV frames showing a figure approaching the pantry and fastening the latch. He explained in plain language what metadata meant, the small hidden tags that say when a file was created or a message was sent, like an invisible signature. He described how deleted messages left fragments, breadcrumbs a trained eye could follow. "It isn't glamour," Lucas said softly. "It's patient work. It's what keeps stories anchored to the facts." Fernando nodded, his jaw set. "We marshal the facts, we protect the witnesses, we make the path from observation to admission clear enough that a jury can't see it as anything other than what it is." That plan required more than evidence. It required witnesses willing to stand in a public space and be scrutinized. Joanna agreed to testify, but she was terrified. She accepted the safe room, the anonymous transport, and the private depositions that Fernando arranged, but the threat messages continued. For days she hardly left her small apartment, and when she did, Fernando sent an escort. Roberto visited her once, his presence clumsy at first. He had never been skilled at offering apology without a speech. "I'm sorry," he said simply, in the little kitchen where Joanna kept her broom, the words raw and small. She gave him a slow, tired look that was not forgiveness, but was, in its way, a kind of permission to try. "You can be sorry, but what Sofia needs is someone who doesn't leave anymore. We all need that." The practicality in her voice steadied him. The press, eager and relentless, began running pieces that suggested complexity. Was this discipline gone wrong, or a sinister pattern? Opinion columnists weighed in about parenting styles and the dangers of outsourcing care. Patricia's team staged a few careful interviews with sympathetic anecdotes about strictness and the importance of boundaries. The press pumps and counterpumps dulled the edges of simple truths, but in closed rooms the team continued to build their case. Court dates were set. The protective order, already in effect, would remain until the matter was adjudicated. The trial itself would be scheduled for a court calendar cluttered with more pressing civic cases, but to Roberto it felt like the hinge on which his child's life might turn. He cut back on business travel, moved critical meetings, and began to spend more time at the hospital, and then, when Sofia was discharged into the care that Christina helped arrange, at the smaller, temporary flat they chose for the early months. It was a place without marble floors, without polishes and portraits, only the essentials and a slow, ordinary schedule. The defense's first tactic was familiar: to shake witnesses and to suggest that data could be read in multiple ways. Dr. Sergio Braga argued publicly that padlocks might have been used for safety, that padlock footage could be misread, that a director's note about hunger could be a child's dramatic expression of the small heartaches every child feels. In court filings, his team hinted at motives. Joanna, he suggested in a barbed motion, could have been resentful at workplace corrections. Teachers could have been misinterpreting normal childhood behaviors. He demanded access to every account Joanna had, every relationship. He sought to recast personal fear as personal grievance.
When he cross-examined in preliminary hearings, his tactics were clinical. He focused on inconsistencies of memory, the precise time Joanna said she had seen a latch, the fractions of a second in which a person might shuffle or close a door. He asked how a child might draw hunger at school without an adult prompting. It was a strategy that aimed not to prove innocence, but to cultivate doubt. The world of evidence, however, is indifferent to rhetoric if preserved correctly. Lucas tightened chains of custody, printed forensic reports that explained processes in plain English, and prepared exhibits that let jurors see a timeline rather than parse lawyerly argument. He offered analogies. "Think of this as a bank ledger," he told the court during a pre-trial hearing. "You can't change the date on a deposit without leaving a record. These logs show entries and exits organized in time. They are reliable in that way." When the judge allowed certain evidence, Joanna's recorded audio, the recovered text messages, the padlock footage, the bank ledgers, Roberto felt a small, practical relief. Not victory, but the knowledge that the story could be told clearly in a space designed for weighing truth. Preparing Sofia for the courtroom was the most delicate part of the work. Dr. Helena explained the boundaries carefully. A child's testimony in open court is fraught, memory can be fragile, suggestibility can be a risk, and re-traumatization is a real harm. Instead, the team arranged for evidence of the child's statements to be presented in a trauma-informed way. Sanitized transcripts, a limited pre-approved audio excerpt from a therapy session wherein Sofia spoke in brief, simple phrases about how she felt when food was withheld.
The audio would be short and child-protective. Words like scared and hungry would be present, but clinical or explicit descriptions would not. Children can be credible, Dr. Helena told the court in a pre-trial procedural hearing. Their expressions, their drawings, their reactions are not the same as adult testimony, but they have their own form of truth. Our role is to present that truth without causing further harm. The judge's office permitted a sitting where Dr. Helena's testimony could be admitted to establish context for the child's health and the drawing's meaning, with the child's statements presented in a closed-circuit format to preserve dignity. The judge, Dr. Carlos Mendez, had been careful from the start. He moved proceedings forward with a steady hand and would later be described by the press as a figure who balanced sympathy with a desire to insulate the process from spectacle. As trial day approached, the smear tactics sharpened in one predictable line: try to intimidate witnesses into silence. Joanna received a letter slipped under her door that said little and threatened much. Teachers who had prepared statements called to say they were afraid. One went quiet for a week, too frightened by anonymous messages to move forward. Fernando protected identities where he could, arranged for secure transport to the courthouse, and worked with a local private security detail on temporary measures. It was not ideal, it was not the role the justice system was meant to play, but it was practical, and it kept people on the stand long enough for the truth to be told. The trial itself assembled like a careful mechanism. Opening statements were measured. Fernando did not declaim. He did not attempt to inflame. We will show you a pattern. We will show you evidence, and we will ask you to make sense of it. Dr. Sergio Braga's opening argued that evidence could be selectively assembled and that competent caregivers could be misread. His approach was precise, legal, and designed to seed doubt. The prosecution's parade of proof moved from the human to the technical. First came Joanna, escorted to testify in a secure witness room that allowed questioning without exposing the child or the witness to unnecessary spectacle. She spoke slowly, eyes down, hands folded. Under oath, she recounted the small incidents, the requests to ration food, the times she had been discouraged from checking on Sofia, the direction to tell family members that the child ate small portions.
Her voice trembled at times. When Dr. Braga tried to paint her as biased, she answered without dramatic flourish, "I was scared of losing my job, but I am not lying." The line landed plainly. She was not perfect on the stand, but she was human, and jurors heard that. Marcia Fontes, the school director, presented the teacher's files, attendance records, the drawing marked hunger, the log entries about missed lunches.
She read a short excerpt from a teacher's note about Sofia. Appeared tired, sometimes without lunches. It was institutional, boring, and in its boredom it gained evidentiary weight. The jury saw not spectacle, but the slow accrual of administrative concern. Then the forensic sequence began in earnest. Lucas walked the court through the recovered footage. He described how the footage was archived, how checksums worked to ensure files were not tampered with, and how he had cross-referenced time servers to verify that the timestamps were accurate. In layman's terms, he explained the concept of a forensic chain of custody, how once someone collects a file, you lock it down and document every hand that touches it. He demonstrated the padlock sequence and then synced that footage to school records and the bank transactions. It read like a drumbeat. Latch at 1742, keypad authorization at 1743, school attendance absent at lunch, grocery receipts showing no child-focused purchases. The cumulative effect was quiet but relentless. Under cross-examination, Dr. Braga tried to poke holes. He asked about the possibility of clock drift on cameras, about alternative explanations for messages, about whether a padlock might have been used for rodent control. Lucas answered patiently, with detail but without theatricality. He presented a server log that showed synchronization to national time servers and an email exchange that confirmed the camera's maintenance schedule. There had been no scheduled maintenance that day. The more the defense attacked, the narrower their options became. Doctoral-level sleight of hand could not erase a pattern compiled across multiple, disparate systems. The medical testimony was short but severe. Dr. Paulo Mendez presented the hospital charts, emphasizing the numbers without sensationalism. At 7 years old, he told the court, 22 kilograms is below the expected range. The child presented signs consistent with chronic undernutrition and dehydration. There are also behavioral signs consistent with emotional withdrawal. Dr. Helena explained in accessible terms how the drawing language could be a child's symbolic expression of unmet basic needs. The word hunger, she said in measured tones, was not mere flourish, it was a communication, and she contextualized it with a developmental explanation a jury could understand. Children often draw the concrete representation of what hurts them. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial, without being gratuitous, came when a carefully vetted, brief excerpt from a therapy session was played. It had been edited under court supervision to protect the child and to present only short, relevant statements. The voice heard was small but present. Sofia said, "The door was closed. I was hungry. I said please. I was scared." There was a breath, a small human intake, and a whisper of, "I like soup now." That last line was a pivot, horror balanced with hope. The courtroom reacted, not with theatrics, but with a kind of quiet recognition. The audio carried the weight not of a cinematic confession, but of a child's blunt facts. Dr. Braga attempted to discredit the audio in cross, suggesting leading questions in therapy, implying suggestion, but Dr. Helena had prepared the context, and the court recognized the safeguards. The child's words, short and kept intact, became a hinge. There were attempts by the defense to present alternative explanations, that the family's absenteeism was the underlying cause of the child's condition, that institutional failure had played a role, that the hired caregiver had been following a problematic but not criminal method. But such arguments rang hollow against the mosaic of data. bank statements showing luxury purchases, private texts instructing staff to keep it under control, Joanna's recording where a caregiver asked staff to limit portions, the padlock footage that displayed a deliberate act of preventing access. The defense's job was to peel away certainty, to show gaps. The prosecution's job was to assemble enough that doubt could not erase intent or responsibility. Those were legal framing exercises, but in the courtroom they arrived as human consequences. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The press argued theory outside the courthouse, while inside the small room the deliberations ranged from forensic minutia to the heart-level topic that everyone had tried to contain. Could a trusted caregiver use a family's privileges to exert control and cause harm? Jurors later said they were struck by the domestic details, by receipts and ladlocks, by school notes and a child's careful drawing. Those small details, jurors said, made the abstract concrete. When the verdict was read, the courtroom's silence felt like a held breath. The foreperson spoke in a calm voice. The jury found the defendant guilty on multiple counts related to child neglect and unlawful restraint. They did not need to articulate a moral posture. The finding was a legal conclusion built on the accumulation of evidence. The judge scheduled sentencing to follow legal procedure. The press would speculate about years and terms, but those specifics drifted into the realm of legal technicality. The family had won a form of legal truth. The system recognized what the data and witnesses had shown. Roberto felt an odd mixture of relief and exhaustion. The relief was immediate and visceral. The exhaustion was a long, heavy thing that sat behind his eyes. He went to the holding area where Sofia sat, hand in his, and did not try to rehearse triumph. The child's recovery would be slow. The legal resolution would not erase nights of fear. But the recognition and the court's finding shifted the future. It created space for safety. Sentencing, when it came, was measured.
The judge imposed conditions that included a custodial sentence and a restraining order, along with mandated counseling and an explicit prohibition against contact with the child and the household staff. The language was legal, the effect immediate. The defense filed appeals, as is their right, and the legal process would continue in a narrower, procedural way. For Roberto, the verdict was not an endpoint, but a relief against which to measure ongoing care. In the weeks after the verdict, the smear machine quieted. Some commentators shifted tone, others doubled down, but the pressure on witnesses eased. Joanna, who had once been petrified, began to visit Sofia in safe, supervised settings. The teacher, who had once hidden a drawing in a folder, sat with the child and read picture books aloud. Roberto made public statements with a different register than the ones he would have offered months before. Less posturing, more humility. He did not offer absolutes. He thanked people who had stood when the consequences were real. The practical work of repair came in small quotidian acts. Sofia learned to eat at a steady pace. Meals were not a spectacle, they were a ritual. A bowl placed on a table, a gentle insistence that she join, a slow conversation about what tasted good. Dr. Helena continued therapy, often playing and drawing, allowing Sofia to name feelings on her own terms. At night, Roberto read stories and made the house smell like slow dinners. He learned to measure portions, not to control, but to nourish. There were setbacks. A nightmare would wake her in the middle of the night, and Roberto would be there, hand on her shoulder, whispering about that day when the sun came back. There were moments of mistrust, hesitations to accept snacks or to go near the kitchen at first, but those wounds healed with repetition and with predictability. Predictability became a cure of its own kind. Regular bedtimes, predictable meals, the same goodnight phrase spoken by a steady voice. Reordering his life was less dramatic than he'd imagined. He did not resign in a single cinematic moment. He sold his share in one non-essential holding, delegated a management role to a trusted lieutenant whose competence had been proven over time, and started to walk to the small school nearby to pick up Sofia when her therapy schedule allowed. He missed a few product launches and did not die. He hired fewer flashy consultants and invited family meals back into the calendar. Wealth, he discovered, had a new measure: minutes spent at a table. There were public moments of difficulty. A gossip column called him hypocritical for years of absence. An investor asked about distracted leadership. He learned to answer with brevity and truth. "I will be where my daughter needs me," he said in one brief interview, and then he turned back to his child. That simple sentence cost him certain meetings, but rewired his life. Months passed, and the small rituals multiplied.
Sofia's hair grew shinier. Her cheeks gained color. She returned to a classroom where the principal placed an extra hand to help ease transitions. Friends from school began to return in invitations, sometimes to play dates that required more supervision than children would guess. She learned to swim, small, clumsy strokes, and for a week asked to practice every afternoon. The novelty of movement returned to her body. Joanna was given a job as a community outreach assistant in a small nonprofit that helped vulnerable families, work that paid modestly and gave her dignity. She and Roberto remained in contact. She visited for family dinners, and the two of them would sometimes laugh at nothing much, the kind of laugh recovered from a hard place. There was also, quietly, restitution. The family funded training for household staff in trauma-informed care and paid for counseling services that covered Joanna and staff who had been affected. Roberto established a small trust for Sofia's education and for a scholarship fund aimed at children in need, a response that paradoxically made him feel less than he had hoped, a gesture insufficient but sincere. The legal appeals dragged as such things do. There were motions and filings that required careful attention. Fernando monitored the process, but the gravitational pull of everyday life had already changed the center of Roberto's universe. The court's verdict made it possible for Sofia to rebuild without the constant legal threat of her presence being undermined by the person who had once been so close. In the recovery that followed, the child became the axis around which a family could orbit with safety. The house they moved into after the temporary flat was small by the standards of Roberto's former life. No sweeping staircases, no gilded frames, only warm wood and a kitchen that was always open. Sofia had her own bowl, a variety of small spoons, and a cupboard stocked with snacks she was allowed to choose from. Rituals, dinner at 6, a reading circle at 8, provided the structure she needed. Roberto learned to be present in small ways that added up: a morning story read with accents, a hand held on the way to school, an errand run with the child in tow. The healing was not linear. There were nights when Sofia would flinch at raised voices on television or hesitated before a cupboard closed. She asked questions, some practical, some existential, that Roberto answered with the honesty of someone who had been reckoning for months. "Why didn't you know?" she asked once, a child's bluntness that cut through choreographed apologies. He did not have a speech prepared. He sat with her and said, "I didn't notice. I am learning how to notice now. I'm sorry. I will do better." Those small confessions mattered more than 1,000 defenses. Time softened the edges of the episode without erasing its importance. Friends of old returned in different ways, some with care, some with distance. Professional life resumed in a narrower band. Roberto no longer measured himself by conference rooms and shareholder votes alone. He began to mentor a small team focused on ethical leadership and on the responsibilities wealth imposes beyond philanthropy.
an effort to reframe success as stewardship with presence. The final months of court reporting contained the necessary procedural gloss, appeals docketed, an administrative hearing on asset questions, but the public drama receded. The narrative that had once dominated feeds was replaced by a different one, a child who was slowly growing stronger, and a father who had reassembled his life around what mattered. That quieter story was less attractive to gossip, but more durable. The epilogue, when it arrived, was not a courtroom scene or a press conference. It was dinner. Sofia, now a little plumper and with a new habit of telling knock-knock jokes at the table, passed bread across the table to Roberto. He watched her as she reached for a small glass of orange juice, the same flavor that had once been a tentative pleasure in a hospital corridor. He thought of the months that had bruised him and taught him, and in a way spared him the hollow gold of ambition without empathy. After dessert, they moved to the living room. There was a small ritual they had devised, 3 things every night. Each of them, father and daughter, named 3 things from the day they were grateful for. It was simple, but it taught attention. That night, Sofia listed a new crayon, a teacher who had read a funny book, and the orange juice. Roberto said the warmth in the kitchen, Joanna's laughter at dinner, and a quiet afternoon walk. The gratitude exercise was not a cure, it was a muscle built by repetition. Before she slept, Roberto tucked a small paper in Sofia's bedside book, a note that said simply, "I am here." He had written it in a shaky hand the first week, and now, months later, his handwriting was steadier. She found the note and traced the letters with her finger, then hugged the book close. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her breathe. He thought of the boardroom phone that had once signaled urgency in a different metric, of the way a single call had reoriented everything. He had learned that the measure of a life was not how many deals one closed, but how many small hands one held through terror and healing. He made a vow that was both private and public, to keep these rules, presence, vigilance, and gratitude, as ordinary parts of his life. He would not pretend the future was simple. He knew the appeals could complicate the legal closure. He knew scars would remain in small memory pockets. But he also knew that simple rituals and the constancy of presence had a power that the polished veneer of old life could never buy. Outside, the city carried on. Buses moved, deliveries were made, the media cycle churned. Inside the house, a kettle boiled, and a child dreamed.
Roberto switched off the light and left the door slightly ajar, a small sign of trust and an open invitation to conversation. It was late, and the house hummed with the ordinary noises of a life being rebuilt. If this story moved you, subscribe and check the playlist for more real-life justice stories.